I want to make sure I can put this up for everybody. Okay, let me get over here.
Good morning, everybody. I got on a little late.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let me get over here. I'm gonna start with talking a little bit about. If I can share my screen. There we go. Okay. Can you guys see that? Okay. Sometimes I need to make it a little bit bigger. Hang on a second.
Yeah.
I can make it bigger. Is that better?
Maybe if I put glasses on.
Hang on a second. Hang on a second. Let me get over here.
Oh.
You guys see that? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. I want to start talking a little bit about ethics and kind of some ethical concerns. Now, I'm not going to get as deep into some of this as you would in a regular ethics class, because when you take an ethics class, you're going to talk specifically even about cases, and most of those cases have something to do with something clinically. So, and I know in this class, and I'm also talking not just to the folks that are here, but anyone that watches this recording, I realize that some people in the class are going the LPC or LMFT route, and then we have some that are going the school counseling route. And there are some differences in the ethics for each of those folks in terms of your licensing. I'm going to talk more, that's one of the reasons why I'm going to talk a little more generally, because as you go through the program, LPC and LMFTs are going to get one kind of type of counseling ethics class, and then school counselors will get their own ethics class. So in general, when we talk about ethics, as simple as, I guess the most simple way to say it is, ethics are a body of principles that address proper conduct. In other words, there's principles as clinicians, whether you're an LPC, LMFT, school counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, anything in the mental health world, which is kind of what we're talking about. We have a list of principles that we follow for proper conduct. And most everyone would be able to say, well, first do no harm, always thinking about the client first, don't harm the client. And then we have everything from that to, how long do you keep records after a client terminates? I mean, there's lots of different principles that we follow. You could call them rules, but principles is probably a better way to think about it. They're not legal rules, they're not laws, they're ethical principles that as a professional, when you're licensed, that you follow. Okay. I think in the book, now in the old version, they had the ACA ethics in the back of the book. I think this version has them too, and you can flip through there and look at them. You can also see all of the ethical principles that are listed for LPCs and LMFTs on the website. And here in a second, if we have a little bit of time, I'll run over there and show you where those are so you can see. Now, laws are a little bit different than ethics. Laws are not really suggestions or principles, they're rules, right? So they're rules that address proper conduct. So, when we think about breaking a law, that's a little bit different than if an ethical principle is broken. If an ethical principle is broken, you could lose your license. If a law is broken, you could go to jail. I mean, it's a little bit different. Now, you could do both. You could break an ethical principle and break a law at the same time. That could happen. But the laws are there to address proper conduct. Okay. Now, and we're going to talk about a couple of laws here in a second. Okay. So I feel like these code of ethics are in the back of the book. Excuse me. So there's just some general ones, and then they talk about competency, informed consent, release of data, diagnosing mental disorders. Here's the general areas that each of the ACA ethics will talk about. There are some some differences in the LPC and the LMFT ethics, mainly revolving around relational contact. And then there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of those ethical principles that are in both, and actually quite a bit. Okay. And we're actually going to talk about the multicultural issues specifically here in a second. Okay. So when we think about client rights, we're going to talk about two different things. So clients' rights and responsibilities and clinicians' rights and responsibilities. Okay. So clients have specific rights. And again, these are under the ethical principles. When we talk specifically about their rights when it comes to assessment, okay, they have a right to be assessed with assessments that meet professional standards, which is one of the reasons why with your assignment, I'm kind of harping so much on make sure things are valid, make sure things are reliable, and especially when we talk about assessing mental health disorders, we really want to make sure that those are meeting current professional standards. They have the right to the results. In other words, when you give an assessment to a client, not only do they have the right to have a really good professional assessment, they also have the right to a professional report in some cases, at the minimum, giving them the results of the assessment. So when you give an assessment, you need to give them the results. And we've kind of talked about how to do that in classes before now. And you can actually say, hey, if you don't take this test, here's some consequences that could happen. That really happens if you work in a clinical setting where maybe taking an assessment. Like I worked with the Bureau of Prisons, and there were not very many times, but there were a couple of times where people just refused to do the intake paperwork. And that in that case was kind of like, hey, you're really going to go back to prison if you don't do this, because that's part of a condition of your parole. That would be kind of an example. That's kind of an extreme example. But I've also had other instances where clients were, I would tell them, hey, maybe we need to do this assessment for depression, let's say, and maybe they didn't want to do that. And I would say, well, we're not going to know exactly what's happening unless we can assess for it. That doesn't happen very much in my experience. Most clients are cool with getting assessments with things that are going on. In most cases, they want to know what's happening. And if they can figure that out, they really want to know. Now, informed consent is again a super basic. I mean, that's foundational. You have to get informed consent before you give an assessment. That's especially true if you work with minors. So some folks that will work with kids and teenagers, getting the approval or the consent of their whoever the parent or guardian is, that's what that means. I actually also get the consent. I mainly work with teenagers, but I also get the consent of the teenagers as well. I do both. But you have to, like in some cases, like if I'm working with a teenager, this happened to me about 6 months ago, where I was working with someone and I just felt like some of the symptoms were showing a certain thing. And I wanted to do an assessment for that thing. And I talked to them about it. They were, I feel like maybe a junior, so maybe 17, which is kind of a gray area. And I talked to them about it and said, hey, I need to get your parents' approval, which was fine. And I called the parent. We kind of talked all together, got the consent, and then did the assessment. But then when you do the results, I did the results with not just the team, but the parent as well. So I did both things.
Dr. Bedard, so what is the cutoff age for that?
So
Getting the
18
consent?
18 is black and white in pretty much every state. In Texas, for sure. If you're 18, you're legally an adult and you don't have to get parental consent. 17 is really a gray area because someone could be a senior in high school and be 17, but technically they're not legally an adult until they're 18. I personally only do consent. I will only do consent just with that teenage client if they're 18. And I will actually even talk to them and say, hey, maybe we should get your parents' consent especially if they're in the house, like they're in high school still. If they're in college, that's a little different. But 18 is the black and white cutoff. That's a good question. Thanks for asking that.
You're welcome.
Now, in terms of responsibilities of the client, being prepared to take the assessment or the test, or, following the instructions and answering honestly, those are kind of those are the things you'll talk to them about and tell them, hey, this is what I'm looking for you to do. Okay, let me get back down here. In terms of responsibilities for the counselor, there's a couple things I want to talk about. We've talked a lot about validity, how to score things, keeping things secure, obviously. You're ultimately responsible for how you interpret, which is scoring, how you interpret it, how you disseminate information about it. If you run into a situation, which I actually ran into a situation about, it was in the fall, maybe November, where I was working with a teenager, and then I ended up working with a family, and I felt like maybe this was branching into an area that I just don't feel competent in, and I for sure didn't feel competent in assessing for it. I told them up front, hey, let's get you assessed in this way, and I actually referred them to a psychologist to get assessment. It doesn't do any good if you don't feel confident, like in the areas, and I'm just throwing out some examples. Like if you don't feel super competent in areas of self-harm or eating disorders, let's say, it doesn't mean you can't work with those folks, but in terms of assessing certain things, or maybe don't feel competent in assessing for alcohol and substance abuse. You're, as a master's, when you have your master's degree, you can assess for those things. You might not feel as competent in those areas, but there are a lot of people that are. You can refer those folks out. And again, it doesn't mean you can't work with them. We're just talking about knowing your competence level. Okay. Some assessments you're going to do with folks, some of you might want to go on and get further certifications in other types of assessments, especially in the personality world, like a Myers-Briggs or a DISC assessment. You want to get further training. That's great. You can do that. Obviously, we need to be aware of like scoring errors, which, like, I think I talked about this a couple of classes ago. There's sometimes where clients could fake something, right? So they could fake that everything's all bad when really it's not, or fake that it's all good when really it's not. Knowing that whatever assessment you're giving can really kind of tell you if that's happening or not. In other words, there's some cutoff scores. Like if they didn't like on certain assessments, if they didn't answer all the questions, or they skipped an X amount of questions, that would tell you that particular assessment is not going to be valid because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. Which actually, if they do that, that kind of tells you, hey, maybe this is something we need to talk about. If they start skipping a bunch of questions on an assessment, that just gives you questions to ask. Okay. I'm going to go through a couple of these. And I'm going to put these slides up on Moodle so you guys can see them. Now, when we talk before we were talking about kind of the laws, the legal aspect. All of these acts are legal, not ethical principles. Okay, these are federal. Most of them are federal laws that deal with everything dealing with how we work with clients. Okay, and obviously some of these are kind of like work related, but all of these apply to everybody universally, in America basically. So there's a couple of these that apply to us specifically. Okay, this is one of the biggest ones, HIPAA. And again, when you take a full ethics class, you're going to talk specifically a lot about HIPAA compliance. So this has everything to do with how records are kept, how consent is signed for, how, do clients have a right to their records, to their notes, to their file, how that would happen. So if we look at this third bullet down here, we are responsible for developing, maintaining, and accounting for disclosures of private client information that they can have access to for a period of 6 years. Okay. Now, having said that, what that means is, for example, it's kind of an interesting time right now. When I first started, everything was paper still, file folders, and I actually still have quite a few file folders from when I first started 10 years ago. Well, I don't have any. Well, I got rid of some. I've been able to transfer some of those out, but when I first started, file paper was the way. Now, with the cloud, you can find HIPAA compliant electronic storage places. For example, the software that I use is called Simple Practice, and it's a HIPAA compliant software package that successfully stores all my client information now. And I've actually been slowly but surely scanning in old paper documents of clients into the system that I can then store. And when that time limit runs out, I can then terminate those documents. The good thing about that is since I'm independent, I can take those with me everywhere. If you were just still doing paper, you still take them with you everywhere, but you have to secure them. So HIPAA compliance, especially in Texas, means having them behind two different kinds of locks. That could be a file cabinet and a door, but the door has to be a certain kind of lock. It needs to be a certain kind of system. Electronically, there needs to be a certain type of encryption that needs to happen. When we think about, and I don't know if it talks about this, it doesn't. When we talk about, can clients have access to their records? Yes, they can. And you have to state that in your paperwork when they first do intake with you, how they go about doing that. Written consent. Most people there needs to be something in writing where they ask for it, and you can give that to them. Sometimes clients are okay if you maybe even give them a summary of sessions. Records can be subpoenaed. So anything in a file, anything in their file can be subpoenaed. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of the legal and ethical implications, but just know that there are some differences between working with an individual and working with a marriage. In a marriage, their file is together. And if they get divorced, one of them might want their file. They have to get consent from the other party, unless they have individual files. It gets a little bit more complicated. So that's the same in families too, but that didn't happen a lot. You could have records subpoenaed, and I've had lawyers contact for subpoenaed records. That happens, and most of the time you're going to turn something over. And I've had a colleague that this happened to about, it was last year. I feel like it was maybe a year ago, maybe in March, where something was subpoenaed, and she had worked with a couple, and the records that were subpoenaed weren't really going to help that person that was subpoenaing the records. It was actually going to hurt them. But she handed them over anyway. Of course, then the lawyer can decide to use it or not. But if you ever have questions, here's a great thing about being part of a licensed body and having malpractice insurance. You can actually call them and say, hey, I have a question. It's a legal question, and they can kind of walk you through it. She actually got representation by the company that we use. That was actually super helpful. Sometimes it just seems murky, and that's the thing about ethics, right? They're principles, and there's some murkiness there. Laws are not as much, but HIPAA specifically can seem a little bit murky, and it's getting a little bit more murky because of telehealth. We're not exactly sure what telehealth is going to, how it's going to affect HIPAA, but a lot of the changes that are coming, like I'm doing a specific ethical HIPAA training in the world of telehealth in a couple of weeks, specifically because some things that are going on now, like meeting with clients that aren't in the same place, like how do you do that, like that kind of thing. Those are some ethical things that you kind of have to think through. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Okay, all right. And again, a lot of these things you're going to talk about in ethics classes. Okay. Any questions about that? Any questions about anything we've kind of gone over there in that world? because I'm going to transition now. Any questions about that? If you're watching this and you weren't part of the class, sorry, can't ask questions. It's too late. That's a joke. Just kidding. Oh, and by the way, all 4 of you that showed up, you guys get instant A's. Just FYI, y'all, everyone. You don't have to do the exam or do a paper. You just get an A. Okay. In the words of my uncle David, anyone that believes that, stand on your head. That's what he used to say for stuff like that. Okay. I want to start and talk a little bit about something that's really important in our world. And I kind of want to talk about it. And I realize it's 9:30 in the morning and it's early. And so we're going to start talking about cultural competence and working with diverse populations. So I'm not necessarily expecting any of you guys to chime in, but I am going to ask a couple of questions and see if we can have a little bit of a discussion. Because I think that one of the to me, a strength of our profession is that in general, we really work hard to be non-judgmental and to be empathetic and to show warmth to the people that we're working with. And in some cases, people that we work with might have a different ethnicity than us, a different gender than us, a different culture than us, different political views than us, a different set of faith beliefs than us. I mean, there could be a lot of differences between the person we're working with and us. And one of the strengths, I think, of a good clinician is to be able to still be non-judgmental with that person. And that can be really difficult, if I'm just being honest. I think it's hard to do in a lot of ways. And so I think it's important for us as clinicians to not just know culturally where people may or may not be, because you're going to take classes. They're going to talk about folks from their cultural standpoint or ethical ethnic standpoint, or how different genders may respond. You're going to take classes about that, and you should. That's what you need to be doing, because we need to learn general information. But there's no better way, to me, to find out about a person, whether it's their ethnicity, their gender, their culture that they live in, or how they grew up. There's no better way, to me, to do that than asking them about it and being curious with them. So here's what I mean by that. Being able to ask questions of clients from a point of curiosity, not from a point of expertise. If that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. If you've had me in other classes, I've actually talked about this before, so some of this will be a little bit of repeat, but I feel like this is really important. I think this might be more important now than it ever has been to me. So I'm going to throw out a term here, it's cultural competence. And in terms of our discussion, let's just talk about culture as this overarching umbrella over ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status. Just for the sake of our discussion, we're going to say culture kind of covers all those things. And so if we talk about cultural competence, if you guys wouldn't mind, if you wouldn't mind saying, hey, when you say cultural competence, here's what I think. Like, what kinds of things would you think of if I say, let's talk about cultural competence? What do you think?
I would
Think
say,
what
for this, I'm sorry, when I think of cultural competence, I would think of knowing something about the ethnicity of the population that you're dealing with, knowing some of the cultural aspects of that, like say I'm African American, what are some of the elements that are affected within my community, what are some of the dynamics that goes with my community, like, just some of the social norms that we deal with. when it comes
Mhm.
to certain things, and so that
Right.
means in order to treat me, you have to know a lot about the African American community to do that.
That's right. That's great. That's great. So knowing something about where that client is coming from, whether it's their
Absolutely.
community, their ethnicity, whatever the culture is, knowing about it, that's good. That's good. Anything else?
I was gonna say,
Background. I'm sorry, Victoria. I would say
it's
the
okay.
background of the child, the ethnicity, how the kid was raised. Because even in
Yep.
the African American community, a lot of those as children are raised by other parents, other like
Right.
grandparents or
Other family
relatives.
members. Right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Good.
I was also gonna say what is specific to that culture as it relates to whether they are another ethnicity and they make eye contact or they don't make eye contact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, for I don't know, for African American culture, we want you to make eye contact. Look at
Want
me.
to see you, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there are other cultures that, you don't, that's something disrespectful.
Gotcha. That's a great
Um,
point. So how we do things non-verbally, even
mhm.
with people that we're working with, and kind of knowing that, that's very good. That's very good. I think one of the things, and you guys have kind of both said it a little bit. The other thing about cultural competence really is that you know yourself as a clinician that you don't know everything. Like going into working with someone, you're not the expert in their culture. They are, right? They are the expert in their own culture. You are basically, this is kind of how I frame it with my clients this way. I'll say, you're the expert of you. I'm coming in, basically I'm coming into your story, not knowing any of the setting or the plot or the characters, or I don't know any of those things. I'm like stepping in the middle of it. I need you to help me understand it. What do you guys feel like? Now, what makes that important to do? What makes being culturally competent as a clinician? What makes that important, do you guys think?
Can you ask that question again?
I want to know why we should think about being culturally competent. What's so important about that?
Oh, it makes your rapport with your client better, right?
It
I
should.
think.
Absolutely. Yeah, it should.
Or it affects
It
how much information you're going to get from them.
absolutely. Yeah. That's I think, Victoria, what you said there is the biggest thing. If you go into a meeting with the client, it you might know some things about the client culturally. You might know just some general things. Like Victoria, you brought up the idea of like eye contact or not having eye contact. You might know some of those things already. Like just from studying, maybe or maybe from your experience, you might know those things. But knowing that one aspect, do you know all aspects? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
So knowing what we don't know is super important, right? And I'll just be honest. I learned something every semester from all of my students that I didn't know because I want to. It's important. It's important to know things because even as students, right? You guys are all students, so you share that, but you might not share anything else. There might be other things that are totally different about your life, right? And everyone's got their own kind of culture that they're coming out of. So we could know some general things about people's culture, that's true, but we don't know everything about their culture. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Now, the thing to me that is very important to think about is how we go about becoming more and more competent. And just so, again, to me, it's like, I don't know. I see it. I grew up competitive and I grew up playing everything athletic. And so to me, it's like a competition with myself, not with the client, but how non-judgmental can I be so that I can learn the most I can about them. That's kind of how I do it. And there's a technique that I learned really, really, really early on. in my pastoral life long ago, been 25 years. 25 years ago, that's really worked for me, by a really, really wise psychologist who was a mentor of mine for a long time. He kind of came into class, and he kind of it's kind of funny how he did it, how he taught us. I'm not going to do what he did to you guys, but he came into class and taught us this, and kind of made us all look stupid, but then had a really good meaning behind it. If you approach anybody as the expert, then that's the kind of relationship you're going to have with them. And that's not necessarily bad. Okay. Don't hear me say that that's bad. Some people that come to you want the expert, want someone to tell them what to do, want someone to say, do these things. And there are some clinicians that are good at that and can do that. And that's their style. And that's fine. What I think, when we work with a diverse population, or a set of clients that are really more diverse than you are, or different than you, I don't think that works as well for rapport building and in creating a really, really good relationship. What I think works is taking what's called a one down approach. And you guys might have heard this in other classes, but so I'm going to totally date myself and age myself right here. So there's this old TV show called Columbo. I don't know if anybody's heard of it or seen it. He was this inspector detective that, he kind of approached everything kind of like, oh, tell me more about that. Help me understand. He kind of always took this one down approach, even though he knew exactly what happened. Like, he knew, of course it was a show, so obviously he knew everything. But walking into a situation and becoming curious about it. Tell me more about that. Help me understand this. Even though you might, like when I work with a couple, I've gotten to this place where I can work with a couple for a session or two and pretty much know pretty much what's going on. But I need them to tell me what's going on. I need to be curious about it so that they can see what's going on. So it's kind of like, Wendy, when you and I did this intake interview, I asked you questions because honestly, I was curious. I wanted to know, but I wanted you to know. I wanted you to become aware. It's that same kind of one down role, in that we are basically taking a step back and becoming ultra curious of the situation. Okay. So I've done this many times working with, we have a population where I was in my office. There's a larger Indian population, from India, and there's several different areas of India that are different. And I didn't know that at first when I started working with the population, but I learned it pretty quickly because I just was like, hey, and I'm very upfront with people that I've never worked with or haven't worked with a lot, and say, as you can tell, I'm a white man, and I'm not you, and I don't have your experience, and I need, not because I'm more important to you, I just want to know tell me what it's like to be whatever, fill in the blank. Tell me, help me understand so I can understand your culture, understand how you grew up and what that looks like and what that means. Not so I can say, oh yeah, that's how I grew up too. That's so similar. That's called priv empathy, which is basically saying, I understand what you just said, and then I make myself more important than you by saying, oh yeah, we're just alike. That's the most ludicrous thing to do in the world, because we're not alike. We're different. And it's okay. Differences is okay. Why not say that we're different and try to understand each other? Does that make sense? Hopefully. Priv empathy, I just brought up a big term. I don't have time to unpack that, unfortunately. You can look it up. It's fairly interesting. But it's basically me saying, taking a story you might tell me, go, oh, I have the same story, therefore what? We're the same. No, we're not the same. We're different. And our story, we might have similar experiences, maybe, but as a white male, I am in the power position because of that. And knowing that is very important. Now I'm being very vulnerable with you guys and very transparent, because I feel like that's important to do. One of the greatest parts of my doctoral education was working through that and talking about that openly with professors and with my classmates and with myself and with my wife. We talked openly about that, understanding that I had situations where at the time in my doctoral program, we were we didn't have any money. I mean, we were super poor, barely making it by financially. I was working 3 jobs, had 2 kids. My wife was working. I don't even know how we made it. We just made it. We made it work and kind of made it through. And I had multiple times clients that I had mainly African American and Latino clients, mostly where I worked for the Bureau of Prisons. Wonder why that is. That's a whole other thing. But that was the main population, and there were multiple times that some of them just kind of came out and said, "You don't understand because you probably fill in the blank." Because I'm a white man, they had that idea, and I don't blame them. And I never said, "Well, you don't know, I'm living on food stamps right now," because we were that poor. But I'm not going to say that. That's not my job to say things like that. But that's when, for me, understanding just my being white and being a male, that was that defined me in a certain way to people, and I had to really think about that, and I have to really be cognizant of that. I hope this makes sense to you guys, because to me that's very important to understand especially when we start talking about cultural competence. We start thinking about power. We start thinking about control. We start thinking about being curious with people. I have to understand that there could be boundaries that are invisible to me that might keep people from talking more to me because of that. I have to know what those are for myself. Does that make sense? Hopefully. I think that those things are really important. Now I'm gonna take a step back here, because like I said, I'm kind of sharing some pretty transparent, very vulnerable kinds of things. Not to build myself up, but I'm just being honest. I mean, this is important. Could you guys talk to me about what you're hearing, what you think?
I just have one question. Is that pre-empathy? Is that pre-empathy or
Priv,
pre-empathy?
priv empathy, PRIV
Oh, priv. Okay.
EMPATHY, priv empathy.
Okay.
Yeah. Ken Harden is the guy that first kind of coined that. Yeah, it's fascinating to read about it, actually. It happens all the time. It's something that's like happens all the time. You have to be mindful of it. Any questions about anything that I'm talking about? Any comments, questions, concerns about anything we're talking about right now? I'm fairly passionate about this, if you can't tell. It's very important, especially clinically speaking. It's very important for us to be aware of our own culture too, which is kind of how I had to learn. I had to learn where I had my own cultural shortcomings, but also my own story. I need to know it and embrace it and know how I got to where I got to. Okay. Just in terms of like cultural competence and taking kind of this one down approach when working with clients, there's actually a fair amount of research that's been done on doing that. Overwhelming, the research tells us that being an expert in those situations does not work very, very well. Being curious works the best, which is almost, if you think about it, it's almost like, to me, anti or countercultural to our world. Our world wants expert, tell me what to do. And then unfortunately, we have platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook that make everyone an instant expert in things that they have no business being experts in. And unfortunately that happens in our world. When we're in the room with someone, do we know more than they do about their dynamics or about how to help people mental health wise? Yeah, we should. Hopefully we know more than they do about that. Yes. So we are quote unquote an expert that they're coming to because they need help. That's true. But we're not an expert in their life. We need to discover what's going on in their life. So actually what we're an expert in is being the most curious we could be. We're an expert in developing rapport. We're an expert in being one down. We're an expert in being curious. That's what we should be experts in. If you take that stance, you have a better shot at being more culturally competent with people. Does that make sense? Hopefully. I don't want to run out of time. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to run out of time, and I don't want to run out of time. There's a couple of things. Man, let me see. We've talked a lot about making sure the assessments are reliable and valid. Early assessments as they were developed, if we were talking, oh gosh, 50s, 60s, 70s, I would say the majority of assessments weren't super culturally competent. They were really normed and developed with white men for the most part in certain circles. It became changing a lot. It's changed a lot over the past 10 or 20 years for sure. Most all of the really good ones have been normed now across cultures even. There's some types of assessment or some concepts that are assessed, like attachment theory is one of them, that we're finding more and more is more of a universal concept across cultures than just a North American construct. We're actually finding that it's true everywhere, but that might not be true about every single type of mental health issue. There are certain parts of the world where schizophrenia, for example, is not seen as a tremendous mental health disorder. It's seen as part of life. And so they wouldn't say, hey, we need to assess for that. That's just part of their day-to-day life. And that's part of their culture, if that makes sense. And so one of the things about having an understanding of what bias means, that's very important. And that's another reason why I want us to be specific on reliability and validity. And when you look up articles that support whatever assessment you're using, now a good study will talk about limitations at the very end of their study. And if they have a limitation like, I'm just making this up, but one limitation would be, hey, our limitation would be, we wanted this particular population, but we got more of this population. Like in my doctoral study, I was looking for couples in general to interview, and I ended up getting mostly, if not all, religious couples. So I had to actually say that as a limitation. Hey, my study is accurate, but really more in this population than it is. I can't make a general statement and say it's true across the board. It's probably true, but I can't say that because my population is only this. In other words, if they tell you at the beginning of their study, hey, we're gonna assess this specific population, and then they end up getting volunteers that kind of leak out into other populations, they need to say that in their limitations, right? And then you can say, well, hey, was this assessment bias? Was there some bias there? Like, what happens if you give Spanish-speaking folks an assessment, but don't help them with the translation? Or what if that assessment that you're giving them is only in an English-speaking assessment? Right? There's bias there. Does that make sense? Like or not, and sometimes you might not know this, and this actually happened to me in one place I worked. What if people aren't as efficient even in the English language, and they grew up in America, went through the whole school system, but they can't read very well, or they have dyslexia, or they have some kind of learning disorder, but you don't know that, right? There's bias there. Does that make sense? I've actually had assessments where I had to read the question with them to help them kind of understand and answer. And so you have to think about some things like that. So there's content bias, how things are structured in the assessment. And we've talked a lot about reliability, how things are generalized. I've kind of talked about some of these. I kind of talked about some of these things. Sorry, my Siri's going off here for some reason. These are just some, and by the way, obviously all this is in the text. I'm just kind of hitting some high notes. As we kind of wrap up a little bit, this is an interesting statistic that I think is important to understand. So the likelihood of a counselor having a client with a physical disability is high. So around 19%, close to 20% of individuals have some type of physical disability. And so that means we have to think about accommodations for them. For example, if you work in a clinic or in an office that is not, now this shouldn't happen, it should never happen, where you can't make accommodations for people physically, then you got to think about things like that, right? I mean, those are things you have to think. So there could be visual impairments, hearing impairments, motor disabilities. There could be cognitive impairment. Now, sometimes you might not know all those things until they show up or till you start talking to them. And that's where our role as clinicians, and again, our role as being kind of like, hey, let me be curious about this, can really help, especially when cognitive impairment is there that might require some neuropsychological assessment. One of the things that I've done, I did this really early on when I moved to DFW. It's interesting because I started teaching about the same time Dr. Armstrong started teaching. And I had actually met him early, like 7 or 8 years before, with when my brother lived in Colorado Springs and he lived there, and we had met, and then we kind of reconnected when he started teaching here at Amberton. He and I kind of joined up, and I have referred people for neuro psychological testing. I don't even know how many people, but he refers people to me in terms of a lot of the clinical work. And so we work really well together, and we can kind of work with clients well together. Yeah, it's really important to build up a network of like psychologists or psychiatrists that you meet, you talk to, you kind of know them, they know you. You can talk about what you like to do and how you work with folks so that they kind of know that. So if you have someone come in, you're like, man, it seems like there's something going on, but you can't put your finger on it. You can then refer them to someone that you know and trust, and they can get tested for, assessed for whatever things might be going on. I am actually starting to work with more older clients. I've been doing. I didn't realize this, but the last 3 years I've had a little. My age of client has gone up. I don't know if that's because I'm getting older or what's happening. We do know that population, the boomer population, is getting older, and they're getting more accepting of counseling. And let me be specific. Mostly in the Caucasian, I would say I work with a high number of white older men right now than I ever have before. Which is super interesting to me. Again, maybe I'm just getting older. I'm not sure. I'm actually working with couples that have been married 35, 40 years, that in their 70s. I've got 2 or 3 of them right now, which is super interesting. That's not happened to me before. That's a totally different dynamic for me. My wheelhouse has always been, couples kind of newly married into their between 10th and 15-year marriage. And then I kind of have this gap where I work with a lot of 20 to 30-year marriages. Mainly because the first 7 years of marriage is the hardest. Mainly because you get married. This is my personal opinion. You get married, you figure out you're really selfish. Then you have kids and you figure out how really selfish you are. And you got to adapt to your whole world again because kids come in. And your marriage usually goes on the sideline because your kids are important. So 7, 10, 12 years in, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I'm married still. And I got these 3 kids. What just happened to me? What is happening right now? And I don't know this person or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but the people that have been married 20, 25 years and their kids are older and they're out of the house, it's like, oh my gosh, now we got to be alone with each other. What does this mean? What does this look like? So I think I get a lot of them, but having some older clients has been super interesting to me. That's a whole That's a little sidebar. That's a rabbit trail. Hey, that's a rabbit trail for those watching the recording. Okay. Now, you guys have any questions about anything we talked about? I just threw out a lot of information there at the end, for sure.
So I came on just a little bit late. Is there anything that you reiterated about the project that we're doing? Like I get the chart part, but as far as the paper and the article,
Mhm.
what are you looking for?
Yeah, I think did I put up like a kind of an outline that I'm looking for? I think I put it on Moodle, I believe. I
Mhm.
talked about it last week. If you just follow that, I think you'll be fine.
Okay.
Uh,
Like if we've actually used some of the assessments, can we share
I
our
would-
experience?
Absolutely. I'd love
Okay.
that. That'd be
Mhm.
great. Absolutely. That'd be smart, actually. I mean, honestly, now this is just private information with 4 of you. If it was me, I would try to do that. I would try to work with assessments that I've already worked with before, because you already kind of know about them, you know. Just easier to write about. And keep in mind with the paper part, right? We're talking 2 to 4 pages, 2 to 3 pages. We're not talking about like, that's not a whole 20-page, you know. Keeping it short's fine.
Mhm.
You know, it could be that I don't want to grade 10 pages a piece, but it's probably more that you don't have to write that much. It's okay. Because I know if I say 2 to 4 pages, I'm going to get 4 to 6 pages. But if I said 4 to 6 pages, I'm going to get 8 to 10 pages, because some people just overachieve. That was me too. I wrote a lot. But the farther you go in your graduate studies, the more you know how to write, and you can write quicker, and you just kind of know what to write.
Mhm.
That helps too. Now I did move the due date back to the 20th. And I put that in the email, I believe. And then we did talk about the exam will open next Friday and be open until the following Wednesday. We did talk about that too.
Mhm.
Okay. Now I got a class full of lifespan development folks that are just cannot wait to be in a class at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I'm gonna jump over there. It's good seeing you guys. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
I didn't know if I'd be talking to myself this morning or not. I had no idea. All right. I'll see you guys Monday night. It'll be our last class Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And be safe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay warm.
Yeah.